He was about to throw out the cat food, then two leopard cubs changed his mind. What should have been an ordinary morning turns into a life or death choice when a lonely man stumbles on something he never expected. Two fragile cubs, abandoned, starving, and hiding a secret more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Suddenly, his quiet life collides with ruthless power, hidden crimes, and a fight he never asked for. As danger closes in, he must decide, does he walk away or risk everything to protect the helpless? And when the truth finally comes out, will saving them also save him? Before we begin, tell me your city or country in the comments. It turns this space from a screen into a circle of real hearts. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy Montana clouds as Calvin Rourke unlocked the back door of his hardware store. His movements were mechanical, born from years of the same routine. The old building creaked as he stepped inside, the familiar smell of metal and wood dust greeting him. Like an old friend, he glanced at the expired cat food sitting by the door. His elderly cat, Murphy, had become pickier lately, turning his nose up at perfectly good food. Calvin sighed, gathering the heavy bag in his arms. At least the local shelter could use it. The crisp autumn air bit at his face as he stepped outside toward the dumpster. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in his carefully ordered world. A weak, plaintive cry, somewhere between a mule and a chirp. Probably another raccoon, he muttered, setting down the bag. But something about the sound made him pause. It seemed too desperate, too young. Following the noise, Calvin rounded the corner of the building. There, partially hidden behind his dumpster, sat a wooden crate. The sides were marked with foreign writing he couldn't read, and several air holes had been drilled into the wood. The crying grew louder as he approached. Calvin's weathered hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside the crate. Through one of the air holes, he caught a glimpse of spotted fur. His heart jumped into his throat. Those weren't ordinary cat markings. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, carefully prying loose one of the boards inside. Two leopard cubs huddled together, their spotted coats dulled by dirt and fear. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. Their eyes, bright with terror, locked onto his face. One of them let out another pitiful cry. Calvin stepped back, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. He knew he should call someone, the police, animal control, maybe even the zoo in Billings. But the cubs looked so weak, their sides heaving with each breath. How long had they been in that crate? "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, but he was already shrugging off his jacket. The larger cub hissed weakly as he reached into the crate, but neither had the strength to resist when he gently wrapped them, both in the warm fabric. The weight of them in his arms brought back memories of holding his wife's cat. Years ago, Sarah had always been the one to care for strays, bringing home whatever wounded creature she found. "Everything deserves a chance," she'd say, with that smile that could melt his protests like spring snow. Calvin carried the bundle through the back door of his store, his mind racing. The storage room had a small electric heater he used during the coldest months. It would have to do for now. "All right," he said softly, setting the cubs down on an old blanket he kept for emergencies. "Just until I figure out what to do with you." The cubs stayed huddled together, watching his every move with wary eyes. They were obviously starving. The expired cat food suddenly seemed like providence rather than waste. As Calvin prepared a mixture of the soft food with warm water, he tried not to think about how his quiet life had just become considerably more complicated. The cubs ate ravenously. When he set the bowl before them, their small bodies trembling with effort. "Someone did this to you," he said, watching them eat. The thought of someone stealing these creatures from their mother, shipping them in a crate like cargo, made his jaw clench. He'd seen enough nature shows to know leopard cubs should still be with their mother at this age. The smaller cub finished eating first and looked up at Calvin with eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young animal. Something in that gaze broke. through the careful walls he'd built around his heart since Sarah's passing. "What am I getting myself into?" he asked aloud, but he already knew he couldn't turn them away. Sarah would have taken them in without a second thought. Maybe it was time he started living up to her example again. Outside, the town of Miller's Creek was beginning to wake up. Soon, customers would be arriving at the hardware store, expecting to find Calvin behind the counter with his usual quiet efficiency. But for the first time in years, his carefully maintained routine had been disrupted. He watched the cubs settle into an exhausted sleep, their spotted sides rising and falling in unison. They looked so small, so vulnerable. Whatever happened next, he knew his lonely, predictable life had just changed irrevocably. Standing up slowly, Calvin went to lock the storage room door. He had a store to open, and some serious thinking to do about what came next. But for now, at least the cubs were safe and warm. Calvin paced the small storage room, his footsteps echoing off the metal shelves. The cubs had finished their meal, and now lay curled together on the blanket, their spotted coats rising and falling with each breath. He'd closed the store for lunch, something he hadn't done in years, just to check on them. "What am I supposed to do with you two?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The expired cat food wouldn't last forever, and he knew next to nothing about caring for wild animals. His experience was limited to Murphy, his elderly house cat, and Sarah's strays over the years. Sarah, the thought of his late wife sent a familiar ache through his chest. She would have known what to do. She always seemed to understand exactly what any creature needed, whether it was a wounded bird or a scared kitten. When she got sick, he had felt so helpless, watching her fade despite all the doctor's efforts. He couldn't protect her then, couldn't save her. The larger cub lifted its head, letting out a small chirp that pulled Calvin from his dark thoughts. Its eyes, still bright despite its weakened state, met his. There was trust there, mixed with fear, a look that made his throat tight. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the keypad. Animal control was the logical choice. They'd know what to do, who to call. But a memory flashed through his mind. Sarah, crying over a news story about exotic animals being euthanized because no sanctuary had room for them. They didn't ask to be stolen from their home, she had said. It's not right to punish them for human cruelty. Calvin set the phone down. These cubs were evidence of a crime, smuggling, probably. He'd heard stories about exotic animal trafficking, even here in Montana. Would the authorities prioritize finding them a home, or would they see them as a problem to be solved quickly? The smaller cub stumbled to its feet, swaying slightly as it made its way to the water bowl. Calvin watched it drink, noting how its ribs showed through its dull coat. They were fighting to survive, these two. Just like Sarah had fought, until the very end. He hadn't been able to save her. The thought had haunted him for years, driving him into his self-imposed isolation. But these cubs, maybe he could save them. The idea stirred something in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before Sarah's illness. Purpose. You two need more than cat food, he said quietly, kneeling beside the blanket. The cubs watched him, no longer shrinking away from his presence. And I need to learn a whole lot, real quick. Quick. The black SUV passed by again, even slower this time. Calvin's hands clenched into fists. He thought of Sarah, of how she'd always stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. 3 days, he said finally, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. But I'll need your help. I don't know the first thing about caring for wild animals. Relief flooded Renee's face. Of course, I'll show you everything you need to know. She pulled out her phone. Let me give you my number. Call or text anytime, day or night, if something seems wrong. As they exchanged contact information, one of the cubs wobbled over to Calvin, butting its head against his leg. The simple trust in that gesture made his chest tight. These cubs needed him. just as he'd needed someone after Sarah died. Maybe this was his chance to be the protector he'd failed to be before. "We should move them deeper into the building," he said, already thinking practically, away from any windows. "I have an old office in the back that I never use. It's more secure." Renee nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. And Calvin?" She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," he replied, remembering Sarah's words. "That's what my wife used to say." Together, they began planning how to keep the cubs safe and hidden. As they worked, Calvin felt something shift inside him, like a rusty door finally creaking open. For the first time in years, he was choosing to fight rather than hide. The thought terrified him, but it also made him feel more alive than he had since Sarah's death. The black SUV passed by one final time, a silent reminder of the danger they faced. But this time, instead of fear, Calvin felt resolve. He had made his choice. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, for the cubs and for himself. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot as Calvin helped Renee load the cubs into her unmarked truck. They'd wrapped them in old blankets, trying to keep them calm during the transfer. His hands trembled slightly as he secured the makeshift carrier in the back seat. "The safe house is 30 minutes away," Renee said, checking her watch. "We'll take the back roads to avoid attention." Calvin nodded, climbing into the passenger seat. The familiar streets of his small town felt different now, threatening somehow. Every parked car and shadowy corner seemed to hide potential danger. They drove in tense silence, Renee taking a winding route through less traveled roads. "Something's wrong," Renee muttered, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. Calvin followed her gaze to the rearview mirror. A dark vehicle had appeared behind them, matching their every turn. "Is that ... Calvin's question died in his throat as a second vehicle emerged from a side road ahead, blocking their path. Renee cursed under her breath, slowing the truck. Maddox's men. They must have been watching the store. She reached for her radio, but before she could grab it, the vehicle behind them surged forward, ramming their back bumper. The impact jolted them forward. The cubs whimpered from their carrier, and Calvin's heart hammered against his ribs. Renee fought to keep control of the truck as it fishtailed on the gravel road. 3 men emerged from the vehicle ahead, their stances aggressive. One held something that glinted metallic in the fading light. "Calvin," Renee said urgently, "whatever happens, protect the cubs. Don't let them take them." The men approached, spreading out to surround the truck. The tallest one, wearing an expensive-looking jacket that seemed out of place, tapped on Renee's window with his gun. "Officer Calloway," he said, his voice carrying easily through the glass. "Mr. Maddox would like his property returned." "These animals aren't property," Renee replied, her voice steady despite the fear Calvin could see in her eyes. "They're evidence in a federal investigation." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Open the door, officer. Don't make this messier than it needs to be." Everything happened at once. Renee threw the truck into reverse, catching their pursuers off guard. Calvin grabbed the carrier as they slammed backward. The cubs cried out in fear. Gunshots cracked through the air, shattering the passenger window. Calvin felt glass rain down on his shoulders as he hunched protectively over the carrier. Renee wheeled the truck around, tires spraying gravel. More shots rang out. Calvin's world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing and the terrified mewling of the cubs. Something hot grazed his arm, a bullet or flying glass, he couldn't tell. They fishtailed onto a narrow forest road, branches scraping the truck's sides. The pursuing vehicle struggled to follow on the tight path. Renee drove with intense concentration, taking sharp turns that sent Calvin bracing against the door. "Hold on," she shouted, then yanked the wheel hard. The truck crashed through underbrush, temporarily hidden from their pursuers. She killed the engine, and they sat in breathless silence, listening to the sound of vehicles racing past their hiding spot. Calvin's whole body shook. His arms stung where he'd been cut, and his chest ached from slamming against the seatbelt. But the cubs were safe, still huddled in their carrier. "Are you okay?" Renee asked, her voice hoarse. "I think so." Calvin touched his arm, his fingers, coming away with traces of blood. "Just scraped up? The cubs?" "They're scared but unharmed." Renee peered through the trees. "We need to move. They'll double back soon." Calvin stared at his bloodied fingers, reality crashing down around him. This wasn't just about saving 2 orphaned cubs anymore. These people had tried to kill them. The quiet life he'd built, the careful distance he'd maintained from the world's dangers, it had all shattered in a few violent moments. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't understand how far they'd go." "Maddox isn't used to people standing up to him," Renee said, checking her phone for signals. "That makes him dangerous." Calvin looked back at the cubs, their spotted faces, peeking out from the blankets. They'd survived so much already, the loss of their mother, capture, abandonment. Now they were caught in the middle of human greed and violence. "Just like he was, what do we do now?" he asked, his voice stronger than he expected. "We keep them safe," Renee replied firmly. "No matter what it takes." Calvin touched his injured arm again, feeling the sting of broken skin. The pain cleared his head, focused his thoughts. He'd chosen this path, chosen to protect these innocent lives. There was no going back to his comfortable isolation now. The only way was forward, through whatever dangers lay ahead. The safe house turned out to be a small cabin tucked away in the woods, its weathered exterior blending into the surrounding pines. Calvin sat at the kitchen table while Renee cleaned and bandaged his arm. The cubs huddled together in their carrier, finally quiet after their terrifying ordeal. "That'll hold," Renee said, securing the last piece of tape. "You're lucky it was just a graze." Calvin flexed his arm carefully. "Thank you." He glanced at the cubs, their small bodies rising and falling with peaceful breaths. "I keep thinking about how they ended up here. Who would stuff baby leopards in a crate and abandon them?" Renee's face darkened as she packed away the first aid kit. "It's worse than that, Calvin. Much worse." She pulled out her phone and showed him a series of photos. These were taken 2 weeks ago at one of Maddox's private airfields. Calvin leaned forward, squinting at the images. They showed crates being unloaded from small planes, similar to the one he'd found the cubs in. But what caught his eye was a larger photo of a magnificent adult leopard. "That's their mother," Renee said quietly. "She was part of a critically endangered bloodline. Maddox's men tracked her for days before." She paused, swallowing hard. "They killed her when she tried to protect her cubs." The words hit Calvin like a physical blow. He looked at the cubs again, understanding now why they'd seemed so lost, so desperate. They murdered their mother just to steal them? "Maddox isn't just some rich collector showing off exotic pets," Renee continued, her voice tight with anger. "He's part of an international network. They target rare species, especially ones with unique genetic lines. The rarer the animal, the higher the price." She pulled up more photos, showing elaborate compounds hidden behind high walls. "These are just his local holdings. He has connections across 3 continents. The animals are just commodities to him, things to be bought and sold. When the mother leopard fought back, she became an inconvenience, so they eliminated her." Calvin felt sick. The quiet life he'd built, the careful distance he'd kept from the world's ugliness, it all seemed meaningless now. Here was evil, real evil, operating right in his backyard. And those cubs, sleeping so innocently nearby, were the last of their bloodline. "How long have you been tracking him?" Calvin asked. 2 years. Renee set down her phone, rubbing her temples. "But he's careful. Uses shell companies, keeps his hands clean." The few witnesses we found either disappear or suddenly refuse to testify. That's why these cubs are so important. They're not just evidence of trafficking, they're proof of murder. Calvin stood up, pacing the small kitchen. His arm throbbed, but the pain felt distant compared to the weight of what he'd learned. "He tried to kill us today," he said slowly. "Over 2 cubs, because they could bring down his entire operation." Renee watched him move, her expression concerned. "Calvin, I understand if this is too much. You didn't ask for any of this." He stopped at the carrier, gently touching the blanket covering it. One of the cubs stirred, making a soft chirping sound in its sleep. The sound reminded him of his cat. At home, of all the simple, innocent things he'd surrounded himself with after losing his wife. He'd chosen safety then, chosen to hide from life's harder truths. "My wife," he said quietly. "She always said that evil wins when good people look away." He turned to Renee, his voice stronger. "These cubs lost their mother to human greed. They're alone in the world, targeted by powerful men who see them as nothing but profit. I can't look away from that." Renee stood up, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "It won't be easy. Maddox has money, influence, people willing to do violence for him, I know." Calvin looked down at his bandaged arm, at the evidence of how far Maddox would go to protect his bloody business. But these cubs, they're not just animals to be bought and sold. They're living beings who lost everything to human cruelty. They deserve justice. Their mother deserves justice. The cubs stirred again, perhaps sensing the intensity of the moment. One poked its spotted head out of the blanket, blinking at Calvin with trust that made his heart ache. These weren't just any leopard cubs anymore. They were survivors, witnesses to their mother's murder, the last of their kind. And somehow, and probably, they'd found their way to him. "Tell me everything you know about Maddox," Calvin said, sitting back down at the table. "Every detail, every connection. If we're going to expose him, I need to understand what we're up against." Dawn broke over the cabin, painting the kitchen in soft golden light. Calvin stood at the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the cubs play with a ball of yarn on the floor. Their movements were stronger now, more confident after a good meal and rest, but the peaceful scene couldn't quiet the storm in his mind. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Renee's voice was gentle behind him. Calvin nodded, not turning around. "Sarah, my wife, she fought so hard against her cancer. I watched her battle every day, but in the end," he took a shaky breath, "in the end, I couldn't protect her." Renee moved to stand beside him, her shoulder barely touching his. "That wasn't your fault, Calvin. Some fights can't be won, no matter how hard we try. I know that here." He tapped his head, then his chest. "But not here. After she died, I built this careful little life. No risks, no attachments, just routine and quiet." He gestured to the cubs. "Now look at me, hiding from armed men, planning to take on some criminal empire." One of the cubs abandoned the yarn to investigate Renee's boots, batting playfully at the laces. She knelt down to scratch behind its ears, earning a purr. "I found a sanctuary in Wyoming," she said. "They specialize in big cats, have top-notch security. The cubs would be safe there until we can build our case against Maddox." Calvin turned from the window. "How far?" 6 hours, maybe 7 with stops. We'd need to move at night, take back roads." She looked up at him, her face serious. "But Calvin, you don't have to come. I can handle the transport myself." He watched as the second cub joined its sibling, both now thoroughly investigating Renee's shoelaces. Their trust in her was complete, just as they'd trusted him from that first moment in the alley. "Sarah used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid," Calvin said slowly. "It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." He met Renee's gaze. "I'm terrified, but I'm not letting you do this alone." Something shifted in Renee's expression, surprise, maybe, or relief. She stood up, closer to him than before. Most people run when things get dangerous. They look the other way, tell themselves it's not their problem. Is that why you work alone? Calvin asked softly. She nodded, a flash of old pain crossing her face. It's easier usually. Safer, but watching you with these cubs, seeing how you've put everything on the line for them. She smiled, small but genuine. It reminds me why I started this work in the first place. The cubs had tired of the shoelaces and were now wrestling each other, their playful growls filling the kitchen. Calvin found himself smiling despite his fears. We'll need supplies, he said. Food, water, blankets. Something to keep them calm during the drive. Renee pulled out a map, spreading it across the kitchen table. I marked out 3 possible routes. Each has places we can stop if needed. People I trust who can help if something goes wrong. Calvin studied the marked paths, noting how they avoided major highways and towns. You've thought this through. Always. She traced one route with her finger. This one's longest but has the most escape options if we're followed. We'll take my truck. It's less conspicuous than your store van. They spent the next hour planning, going over every detail. Renee's thoroughness helped calm Calvin's nerves, gave him something concrete to focus on beyond his fears. She knew every mile of the journey, every potential danger, every backup plan. As they worked, Calvin found himself watching her, the intense focus in her eyes, the way she gestured when explaining something important, how her whole face lit up when the cubs did something particularly cute. She caught him looking once and smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. What? She asked. Thank you, he said. For trusting me with this. For showing me that doing the right thing still matters. Renee reached across the table, hesitating for just a moment before placing her hand over his. Thank you for reminding me I don't have to fight alone. The touch was simple, but it sent warmth through Calvin's chest. For so long, he'd held the world at arm's length, afraid to care too deeply about anything or anyone. But sitting there, planning this dangerous mission with Renee while 2 orphaned cubs played at their feet, he felt something long dormant stirring. Back to life. We should get ready, Renee said softly, though she didn't move her hand. Night falls in 8 hours. Calvin nodded, turning his palm up to properly hold her hand. Together then. Together, she agreed. Squeezing his fingers gently. The cubs chose that moment to pounce on a stray piece of paper that had fallen from the table, their antics breaking the tender moment. But as Calvin and Renee laughed at their playful battle, he knew something had changed. His fear wasn't gone, but it no longer felt like a wall between him and life. Instead, it was just one part of doing what needed to be done, of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The night was ink black as Renee's truck wound through Montana's back roads. Calvin sat in the passenger seat, the carrier with the cubs secured between them. Every few minutes, he checked on them. They were sleeping peacefully, worn out from playing earlier. 3 more hours to the sanctuary, Renee whispered, keeping her headlights dim. The narrow road snaked between towering canyon walls, barely visible against the starlit sky. Calvin knew these roads from his younger days. There's a wider stretch, coming up in about half a mile. Bright lights suddenly flooded their rearview mirror. A black SUV roared up behind them, engine growling in the quiet night. Maddox, Renee said through gritted teeth. She pressed the accelerator, but the truck's engine whined in protest. The SUV rammed them from behind. The cubs woke with frightened yowls as the carrier slid forward. Calvin braced himself against the dashboard, his heart pounding. There's another one, he shouted as a second SUV appeared ahead, blocking their path. Renee yanked the wheel hard, taking them onto a rough side track that cut through the canyon. Rocks clattered against the undercarriage as they bounced along the uneven ground. We can't outrun them, she said, fighting to keep control. Not in this terrain. Calvin's mind raced. He knew these canyons like the back of his hand, had spent countless weekends exploring them before Sarah got sick. Take the next left. There's an old mining track that loops around. The truck lurched as Renee made the turn. Behind them, the SUV's headlights bounced wildly as they gave chase. The cubs huddled together in their carrier, trembling. "The track narrows ahead," Calvin warned. "They won't be able to follow side by side." As if on cue, one SUV tried to pass the other. The move forced both vehicles to slow, giving Renee and Calvin precious seconds of lead time. But then came the sharp crack of gunfire. "Get down!" Renee shouted as their back window exploded. Glass showered over them as she swerved, trying to make them a harder target. Calvin threw himself over the Cubs' carrier, shielding them with his body. Another shot pinged off the truck's frame. He could smell burning rubber as Renee pushed the truck to its limits. The track curved sharply, revealing a dead end ahead, a wall of rock stretching up into the darkness. "We're trapped," Renee said, but Calvin shook his head. "No, there's a cave entrance on the right. Big enough for the truck, but those SUVs won't fit. Trust me." Renee didn't hesitate. She swung the wheel hard, and the truck plunged into the darkness of the cave. She killed the engine and lights, plunging them into total blackness outside. They heard the SUVs screech to a halt. Car doors slammed. Flashlight beams swept the cave entrance. "They're in there," a gruff voice called. "Flush them out." Calvin heard footsteps approaching. In the dim light filtering in from outside, he saw Renee reach for her service weapon. But they were outnumbered, and any firefight would put the Cubs at risk. That's when he saw it, the old support beam near the cave mouth, worn by decades of weather. One good hit would bring down enough rock to block the entrance. "Take the Cubs," he whispered to Renee. "There's another way out through the back of the cave. I'll hold them off." Calvin, no, but he was already moving, slipping out of the truck and into the shadows. The beam was only 15 feet away. If he could just reach it. A flashlight beam caught him in the open. "There!" Someone shouted. Calvin ran, not toward cover, but straight for the beam. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off rock around him. He heard Renee scream his name. Pain exploded in his shoulder as a bullet found its mark, but adrenaline carried him forward. He slammed into the beam with all his weight. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then came the groaning of ancient wood giving way. Rocks began to fall as the ceiling shifted. Calvin stumbled backward as the cave entrance collapsed in a thundering avalanche of stone and dust. Darkness fell. Complete silence followed. "Calvin." Renee's voice was choked with fear. Her flashlight beam cut through the settling dust, finding him slumped against the cave wall. She ran to him, the Cubs crying softly in their carrier. "You're hit." "Oh God, you're bleeding." Calvin managed a weak smile. "Just a scratch, Did they make it through?" "No, the entrance is completely blocked." She pressed her hand against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "What you did was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen." "Maybe both," he wheezed, then winced. "The back exit. Quarter-mile in. Leads out to River Road." Renee's free hand found his face, thumb gently wiping dust from his cheek. "We'll get you there. Just stay with me, okay? Stay with me." He nodded, letting her help him up. The Cubs watched with worried eyes as she guided him back to the truck. His shoulder burned with each step, but the pain felt distant compared to the fierce joy of knowing they were safe. Renee and the Cubs, both protected. For the first time since Sarah died, he'd chosen to fight instead of hide. Chosen to put himself between danger and those who needed protection. The decision had come without thought, as natural as breathing. The morning sun painted Montana's mountains in shades of gold as police cars surrounded Maddox's estate. Calvin and Renee watched from a safe distance, his arm in a sling, her hand steady on his uninjured shoulder. Maddox's fury had been his undoing. After the cave incident, He'd stormed into Calvin's hardware store in broad daylight, waving a gun and shouting threats about the cubs. Security cameras caught everything, including his admission about the smuggling ring and the murder of the cubs' mother. "I own this town," he'd screamed, his polished exterior cracking. "Those cats are worth millions on the black market. You think your little shop and that wildlife officer can stop me?" What Maddox hadn't noticed was Renee's backup team positioned throughout the store, recording every word. His complete network unraveled in minutes, names, dates, shipping routes all spilling out in his rage. Now, Calvin watched as federal agents led Maddox away in handcuffs. The land developer's perfectly pressed suit was wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. His empire of threats and corruption collapsed like a house of cards. "They found documents linking him to smuggling operations in 3 countries, Renee said, smiling. "He won't hurt any more animals or people." Calvin nodded, thinking of the cubs safely settled at the wildlife sanctuary 200 miles away. He'd visited them yesterday, watching them play in their new enclosure. They were already looking healthier, their spots glossy in the sunshine. "You know," Renee said softly, "most people would have walked away when things got dangerous. But you didn't." Calvin touched his injured shoulder, remembering the moment in the cave when he'd chosen to act rather than hide. For years after Sarah died, he'd wrapped himself in routine like a shield. But protecting the cubs had awakened something, he thought. He'd lost the courage to care, to fight, to live fully again. "Sometimes," he said, "the right thing finds you when you're not looking for it." Renee squeezed his good hand as they watched Maddox's men being loaded into police vehicles. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and possibility, and Calvin felt lighter than he had in years. The battle was over, but its gift remained. The knowledge that he could still choose life over fear, love over loss, courage over comfort. Calvin stood at the sanctuary's observation deck, watching the cubs chase each other through tall grass. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning when he'd found them behind his store. Now their coats gleamed with health, their movements strong and playful. Gone were the frightened, starving creatures he'd rescued, in their place bounded. 2 vibrant young leopards finding joy in their new life. "They're doing so well," Renee said, stepping beside him. Her presence had become familiar, comforting. Like the cubs, she'd entered his life unexpectedly and changed everything. The morning newspaper lay folded in his back pocket, its headline announcing Maddox's 20-year prison sentence. The land developer's empire had crumbled completely, his property seized, his reputation destroyed. Justice had come swiftly once his mask of respectability fell away. Hard to believe that's the same man who terrorized half the county. Calvin mused, remembering Maddox's desperate rage in those final moments. All that power, gone like smoke. Renee leaned against the railing, her shoulder brushing his. "Sometimes the biggest bullies fall the hardest. But I'm more interested in how far others have come." She looked at him meaningfully. Calvin felt warmth spread through his chest. These past months had transformed him in ways he never expected. The man who'd hidden behind his counter, avoiding life, seemed like a stranger now. That Calvin would never have stood up to Maddox's threats, never have found the courage to love again after Sarah. They walked together through the sanctuary's paths, passing other rescued animals. Each had its own story of survival, of second chances. Like the cubs, like himself, back in his truck, driving home through Montana's autumn landscape, Calvin thought about how much had changed. Renee's hand rested easily in his, their fingers intertwined. What had started as an alliance against Maddox had grown naturally into something deeper, shared meals, long talks, quiet understanding dotted his house. Old Tom the cat greeted them at the door, purring loudly. Calvin filled the cat's bowl with fresh food, watching the elderly feline eat with contentment. Once, this simple routine had been his whole world, a shield against pain, against living fully. Now it was just one pleasant moment in a life rich with meaning. "Remember how scared you were when we first met?" Renee asked, settling onto his worn couch. You barely wanted to talk to me. Calvin smiled, joining her. I was trying so hard not to get involved. Thought if I just stayed quiet, kept to myself, nothing could hurt me again. He shook his head at his former self. Those cubs didn't just need saving, they saved me right back. They showed you what was still possible, Renee said softly, understanding in her eyes. Yes, Calvin agreed, thinking of those first desperate days with the starving cubs, how protecting them had awakened something he thought long dead. They reminded me that life doesn't stop, that hearts can heal. Through his living room window, the Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors. Calvin watched it with new eyes, appreciating its beauty in a way his grief-numbed self couldn't have managed months ago. Sarah would have wanted this for him, he realized, not just survival, but revival. Not just existing, but truly living again. Renee's head rested against his shoulder, her presence both exciting and peaceful. The cubs had started his journey back to life, but she had helped him complete it. Together, they had fought for something bigger than themselves and found each other in the process. Tom hopped onto Calvin's lap, kneading contentedly. The old cat had adapted well to change, just like his owner. Calvin stroked the familiar fur, his heart full. He wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding. He had found his way back to hope. If this story warmed you tonight, subscribe and leave a single line that stayed with you. Your words shape tomorrow's story.